Um, I guess, I guess you all know me, but just in case not, I'm Tariq Maudud, the director of this Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. And I'm very pleased to welcome back Alexandra to the center. She was here as a visiting PhD student a number of years ago. So welcome back, Alexandra. Good to see you, even if only on the screen. Alexandra Avena Koenigsberger obtained her law degree in Mexico at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and her PhD at the Universidad Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And that was, part of that was when you came to Bristol. In her PhD dissertation, Alexandra analyzed whether multiculturalism is an adequate framework for achieving ethnocultural justice in the Latin American region, with a special focus on Mexico. She currently works as a judicial clerk at the Electoral Court in Mexico, where she specializes in the political rights of women, indigenous people, and other minority groups. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us on why does Latin American interculturalism oppose multiculturalism? So Alexandra, you'll be presenting for 45 minutes or so, however long it takes, and then I'll invite people to come in to ask questions, make comments, and we can have a discussion. So over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Tariq. I'm also very happy to be back here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everybody who is joining us today. I will be talking about why in the Latin American region, there has been a rejection to multiculturalism. It's not that everybody rejects multiculturalism, but there is a part of the academia and of some sectors of the society that are rejecting it. And this is where I will be focusing my presentation. So this should not be new to us. I'm going to share my presentation. There, can you see it? I'm not sure if you can see my presentation. Can somebody confirm?
Yes, we can. I can see it anyway.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. As I say, this rejection to multiculturalism is not something new to us. Ever since multiculturalism emerged as a political theory for managing cultural diversity, it has been thoroughly questioned. Until recently, however, these attacks on multiculturalism were first of all taking place among liberalism or beyond liberalism, but they were framed under political theory and political philosophy discussions. And precisely because of that, one of the main or the discussions were based on which is a basic principle of justice that we should embrace to develop a theory for managing cultural diversity. In recent years, however, and as many might be aware of, multiculturalism has been attacked by interculturalism. These critiques are rather different than the ones I previously mentioned, and they have been motivated in part by social and political movements throughout Europe and the European Union, as well as the raising of nationalism and the right. And also, as Tariq has already suggested, they have increased ever since 9/11. So according to some part of the academia, but also some political actors, this situation has been created by multiculturalism. And this is the reason why they have suggested that we should abandon multiculturalism and instead we should adopt interculturalism. As probably everybody here is aware of, Tariq Maudud has been leading this debate that has now better been known as interculturalism versus multiculturalism. I will not say much about this debate because this is not the main purpose or my main purpose. But what I will be saying is that these discussions have focused on two different versions of interculturalism, one which is the Quebecois version and the other one which is a European version. Little attention has been given to the Latin American version of interculturalism, which it also tends to reject multiculturalism. So the purpose of my presentation is precisely to present the main critiques of the Latin American version of interculturalism and to try to address them. I will try to argue against them because my intention will be to argue that Latin American interculturalism might be an adequate theory for managing cultural diversity in Latin American societies, but it does not oppose to multiculturalism. And in fact, we should understand it as a version of multiculturalism. Before starting my main points, I do need to make a clarification because my research has only focused on studying the literature that has tried to engage in discussions or debates with multiculturalism, understood as a political theory for managing cultural diversity. So I am aware that the concept of interculturalismo or interculturalidad have been studied from other approaches, for instance, anti-colonialism and so on. But I will not be discussing these approaches precisely because my main studies or my main research has been focusing on multiculturalism as a political theory for managing cultural diversity. So just I made here a slide of the literature that I have been analyzing and the one that I will be basing my analysis. I just listed it there. If somebody's interested at the end on this literature, I am happy to share the slide or to share the list. So that being said, I will start by offering a little more of context on what is going on in Latin America regarding cultural diversity. I will be focusing on Mexico because this is my country and it's the one that I know the best, but I do think that many of the things I will be saying here are applicable to other countries. So, as some might be aware of, in Mexico, the main source of cultural difference are indigenous populations. According to the last national census, approximately 20% of the Mexican population self-identifies as indigenous. And it is not until relatively recent that around 25 years, more or less, that these groups started to make claims of recognition to the Mexican institutions. I have identified for only analytical purposes 2 groups of demands that these groups that these minorities are making. One, I have identified it as claims of cultural recognition and accommodation. And these are claims that are based on the notion that indigenous peoples still preserve some of their own forms of organization and they still preserve cultural differences. And I have also identified under this group of claims 2 subgroups of claims, which I have following the terminology of multiculturalism and especially of Quebecois' account of multiculturalism, I have identified them as claims for territorial autonomy, which intend to allow these minorities to continue exercising their forms of social and political organization. And the second one, also following Quebecois' terminology, I borrowed it and called these claims of fair terms of inclusion. And these are based on the need to redesign state institutions to recognize cultural differences and to include them in the decision-making processes and the national narratives. The second group of claims that I have identified are claims of equality and equal opportunities. And these are demands of institutional support to overcome their marginal situation. this second point will be is important to bear in mind, and this will be important towards the end of my presentation, because I do think it is important to remark that indigenous peoples in Latin America are not only cultural minorities and are not only facing cultural-based injustices. They are also positional groups. They also face serious disadvantages and other sorts of injustice, such as discrimination, exclusion, marginalization. They face many inequalities on terms of distribution of goods and resources and of life opportunities. So this, as I say, will be important towards the end of my presentation. So many Latin American countries, and including Mexico, have introduced legal provisions in order to respond to the claims and demands that these groups are making. In the case of Mexico, the national constitution was modified in 2001, and that incorporated group differentiated rights, trying to address these claims and demands. However, and despite of this, there has been a common feeling among indigenous peoples, NGOs, academia, and large part of the society that these arrangements have been insufficient to attend the claims and needs of these minorities. And some of these feelings of unsatisfaction have been studied by academia. And some of these studies have linked the failure of the state to address these claims with multiculturalism. So the argument goes sort of as follows: because the state has been working under a multicultural framework and multiculturalism is insufficient or inadequate to address the demands of minorities. This is the reason why all the actions of the state have been insufficient and have failed to address or to properly address the demands of indigenous peoples. And so they suggest that we should abandon this multicultural framework and start working under an intercultural framework. So the question is, or the question that rises is, what is interculturalism? Why is it better than multiculturalism? And why do interculturalists think that multiculturalism is not adequate? And here we find the first problem. And in my opinion, this is not only a problem of the Latin American literature, it's also a problem in general with other versions of interculturalism. And it is on the fact that because they have been so concerned on arguing against multiculturalism or in making a case against multiculturalism, they kind of have failed or have neglected to develop a proper theory with basic principles that we can identify as interculturalism. So, so this also occurs in the case of the literature of Latin American interculturalism. We find a lot of critiques against multiculturalism, and they kind of compare it, like what they will say, for instance, well, multiculturalism does that, but interculturalism is better because of this. So this is how they kind of have been developing the literature on this regard. However, I have been able to kind of construct some core features of Latin American interculturalism, and I have summarized it in 3 main points. First, it is an opposition to cultural domination. Secondly, it looks for to generate transformative actions that will lead to substantial equality. And third, the need of an intercultural dialogue that will lead to peaceful coexistence between different cultural groups. However, multiculturalism already includes this. And actually, this is something that has already been argued by Tariq and by Nassar Mir nearly 10 years ago, I believe successfully. And they have also argued that all of these features are also in any account of multiculturalism. So still, this does not give us any clear definition of what interculturalism is. And so, as I say, this is a problem. What I will do now is try to analyze the critiques that they have been making to multiculturalism and try to understand if by these critiques we can kind of form an idea of what interculturalism is. And at the same time, I will try to argue or to analyze if these critiques are adequate or are not. So this is what I will be doing next. So the first critique that I have identified is the one that argues that multiculturalism equals affirmative action policies. And because of this, they argue, it fails to address ethnocultural justice, and it only generates more prejudices and stereotypes, leading to parallel societies. That is the argument. So first, I think this critique is misleading and is not accurate. I think one of there are two mistakes in this critique. First is that they confuse multiculturalism with group differentiated rights. And then they confuse group differentiated rights with, or they equal group differentiated rights with affirmative action policies. I believe this is inaccurate, and I will elaborate a little more on this towards the end of my presentation, but for making this argument, I think there is a difference between multiculturalism, understood as a political theory for managing cultural diversity and for accommodating and recognizing cultural minorities. And although I am aware and I acknowledge that there are different versions of multiculturalism, I think it is safe to say that all of them agree with these basic principles, which is one, equality, or the existence of more than one cultural group in a state, and and that these groups should stand in equal terms. Secondly, a rejection of the blind difference approach and of nation building projects that demand assimilation. And thirdly, a willingness to remediate these injustices based on cultural differences. So that is what very broadly and in very general terms, I would identify as multiculturalism as a political theory. Then we have multicultural models, which are, as I understand it, the way how these principles and the goals of multiculturalism are translated into public policies and rights that will help or that will lead to continue constructing a multicultural state. Among these models, we find group differentiated rights. And but this is only one model. There can be other models, and as I say this, I will be talking more about this towards the end of my presentation. So first thing I think it's mistaken is to identify that multiculturalism is only translated into group differentiated rights. I think there is a difference on this. And the second thing I believe is mistaken with this argument is to suggest that group differentiated rights equals affirmative action policies. Although they are kind of similar in the way how they present themselves, because they are differentiated treatments that are targeting certain vulnerable groups, I believe there are important differences that should not take us to think of them as equal. And I will only mention very quickly two main differences, which are, sorry. The first one is that affirmative action policies are embedded in the distributive paradigm of justice. And they tend to ensure that members of disadvantaged groups have equal opportunities and a just distribution of goods and resources. On the other hand, group differentiated rights are located within multiculturalism, and multiculturalism is located within the politics of distribution. And although it recognizes that distribution is an important aspect of justice, it rejects to narrow down aspects of justice to distribution. So instead, it seeks to reshape institutions in order to incorporate the perspectives of all cultural minorities within a state. This is the first difference between group differentiated rights and affirmative action policies. And the second one is that precisely because affirmative action policies are embedded in this distributive paradigm of justice, they are temporal measures, which by departing temporarily from the principles of equality and non-discrimination, it tends to strengthen the liberal concept of equality in the long term. Group differentiated rights are not temporal. They intend to remain as a design of the state institutions as long as cultural minorities are making claims of recognition and accommodation. So I think the differences between affirmative action policies and group differentiated rights are important. And this is why I believe that this first critique is not accurate. So this would be the only critique I think is mistaken. The other critiques that I will be addressing shortly might not be so, I don't think they are so adequate. They might not be as rigorous enough, but this one I do definitely believe it's mistaken. So now I'm going to analyze the second critique against multiculturalism. And it's related with the fact that, according to these scholars, multiculturalism is a simple way of toleration, whereas multiculturalism goes beyond toleration into coexistence and interaction among cultures. In order to address this critique, I will mention that there has always been a complex relation between multiculturalism and toleration. I will not expand on this because this would take me away from my objectives, but I will mention two things that I think are important in order to address this critique. First is that within the liberal framework, there has been many discussions regarding the relation between multiculturalism and toleration. It has been discussed whether multiculturalism should tolerate illiberal cultures. And liberals have been facing a dilemma on this regard, and the dilemma goes as follows. Either they tolerate illiberal practices, and this means sacrificing personal autonomy of the members of the minority culture, or they decide not to tolerate these practices, and then they be accused of being intolerant and thus imposing liberal values to other cultures. So this dilemma means that any decision they take will mean sacrificing one of the main values or principles of liberalism. So there are many positions regarding this on this discussion, but what I mention it because it is important to know that this has always been a concern within liberals. And so I don't think it is as easy or as simple as just claiming that multiculturalism equals toleration, because I think this should be much more rigorous, and they should elaborate a little more on this critique. So what I do want to suggest is that, I mean, this is a discussion that has been taken place in the debates of liberal multiculturalism, and so I think it is not as simple as just saying this. On the other hand, the second thing that I would say in order to address this critique is that even within multiculturalists, there is so some multiculturalists have suggested that the concept of toleration is problematic and sometimes at odds with multiculturalism. And here I'm referring to the case of Soon Lagarde, and there probably are other multiculturalists, but I'm talking now on his work. So according to him, the concept of toleration understood as putting up with difference one dislikes or disagrees with is problematic for multiculturalism. And first of all, because this concept is negative in two senses. First, it assumes a negative attitude towards certain practice, dislike of certain practice. And secondly, the act of tolerating consists in a negative attitude, which is refraining from acting in a specific way, while I could act in suppressing that practice, I decide not to act. And multiculturalism, on the other hand, is positive. It means recognizing positively different practices and different cultures. And secondly, it demands for a positive attitude by enacting policies and rights that will accommodate these practices. So this is the first reason why toleration, or this concept of toleration, might be problematic for multiculturalism. And the second reason is that, according to this concept of toleration, it assumes that there is an authority or a dominant culture that could interfere, suppressing the practice of the minority, but it decides not to. It decides to tolerate it. So this means that there is a relation of subordination between cultural groups. And this is obviously contrary to multiculturalism, because according to multiculturalism, there should be a relation of equality among cultural groups. So as I say, so even within multiculturalism, there has been suggestions that toleration is problematic for the purposes of multiculturalism. And so they also suggest that we should go beyond toleration. So, so what I would say regarding this second part that I have just commented is that this critique against multiculturalism seems to not be so accurate. And moreover, the concerns of Latin American scholars regarding toleration are similar than the concerns of some multiculturalists, which might suggest that Latin American interculturalism is not similar to multiculturalism. So now the third critique that I will be addressing is similar to the one I have previously mentioned, but it has to do with the fact that, according to some scholars, multiculturalism imposes liberal values. And this critique is mainly addressed to Quebecois and to his classification of group differentiated rights, especially regarding the internal restrictions that he distinguishes from external protections. So according to these scholars, by rejecting internal restrictions as a way of protecting individual autonomy, this theory imposes liberal values and fails to respect the different conceptions of the good. So what I would say regarding this critique is that this has been something discussed both within liberalism and beyond liberalism. Among liberals who have discussed this, I will only mention the version of multiculturalism of Jeff Spinner-Halef. There are other liberals that are a little more radical, but I will not mention them because they are not identified or they are not friendly to multiculturalism. So for instance, Jeff Spinner-Halef argues that expecting minorities to adopt liberal values undermines pluralism and toleration. And he suggests that a liberal society should be able to accept minority groups that do not adopt liberal norms. And so he advocates for a version of multiculturalism that not only defends personal autonomy, but also pluralism and toleration. And he argues that these values should be properly balanced. So although he suggests that any theory of recognizing and accommodating cultural minorities must protect as much as it can personal autonomy, he also suggests that we should accept the fact that there are people or groups of people that use their own personal autonomy to join groups that do not incorporate liberal values. And this, he argues, should be accepted and respected. So the reason why I bring up this version of multiculturalism is just to note that this has already also been a discussion within multiculturalism. So the discussion has been based on whether multiculturalism imposes liberal values, and more importantly, if there is the possibility of developing a version of multiculturalism within the liberal framework that does not impose liberalism. And maybe what I will say now is not so popular and maybe some will not agree, but still the way I understand Quebecois' account of multiculturalism, which is the one that has been receiving all these critiques that it is too liberal and that imposes liberalism and so on, even I believe, as I understand it, even Quebecois recognizes that it would not be correct to impose liberal values, and that when we face an illiberal cultural minority, we should try to liberalize it by engaging in an intercultural dialogue. So this, I think, means that even Quebecois is aware of this dilemma. And as I say, they have been trying to develop a theory of multiculturalism that does not impose liberal values. So I believe that it is not as simple as just saying that multiculturalism imposes liberalism, precisely because this has been a concern, and there has been a lot of discussions regarding this. And the second thing that and more importantly, I believe, that needs to be said regarding this critique is that this is something that also has been analyzed by non-liberal versions of multiculturalism. And this is the case of the versions of multiculturalism of both Tariq Modud and Biku Parek. And according to them, multiculturalism is liberal bias, and especially Quebecois' version of multiculturalism. And well, the reason why, according to Tariq, I believe that Quebecois' multiculturalism is liberal bias is a little different, because he's a little more concerned, as I understand it, with ethnic minorities in Europe. So so I think the critiques are a little different in this regard, but it doesn't matter. I think what is important here to mention is that this has also been analyzed by non-liberal versions of multiculturalism. And what they suggest is that Quebecois' version of multiculturalism does not justify good enough why illiberal cultures should adopt liberal values. And Parek argues that by expecting illiberal cultures to adopt liberalism, liberals are failing to appreciate cultures in their own terms. And he also suggests that we should stop from dividing the world and liberal cultures and the liberal cultures, and rather we should accept that there are different and existing views of the good, and that we should find a way of living with this. So as we can see, this is similar to what Latin American interculturalists are criticizing. Parek deals with this problem by talking talking of a multicultural society. So rather than talking about liberalism and then within a liberal framework trying to accommodate theory of multiculturalism, he kind of inverts this and he says, well, let's talk about multicultural society with these multicultural principles. And then within that multicultural society, we have different cultures and different groups. Some might be liberal, some might not be liberal. And because multiculturalism is on the top, and multiculturalism advocates for peaceful coexistence between different cultural groups, then the fact that we have liberal cultures and the liberal cultures coexisting should be something valid and respected. So this is the way how, very, very summarized and very simplified, how he kind of gives a solution to this problem regarding the imposition of liberal values. I cannot further analyze this version of multiculturalism, but my intention by mentioning it is for two reasons. First, because if anything, this critique against multiculturalism, if anything, should only be applicable to the liberal versions of multiculturalism. And secondly, the reason why I brought up this version of multiculturalism is to suggest that it is very similar to the Latin American concerns, the concerns of Latin American interculturalism. So this kind of leads me to continue thinking that Latin American interculturalism might not be an alternative to multiculturalism, but rather it might be a version of multiculturalism that does not need to be liberal. So finally, the final critique I will be analyzing, and which will lead me to my concluding remarks, is the one that suggests that indigenous peoples in Latin America do not fit within the typology of minorities, nor with the type of group differentiated rights developed by Quebecois. This is a fact, and this is because indigenous cultures in Latin America are not necessarily territorially concentrated, and many of them have lost their societal cultures and are now intermixed in other cultural groups, such as peasants or even the majoritarian culture. And this critique, I argue, is correct. I believe I agree with it. Because unlike many other countries, such as Canada or Scandinavian countries, not all indigenous peoples in the Latin American region are territorially concentrated. So the rights based on territorial autonomy are only adequate for one part of these groups, the ones that are only territorially concentrated. So I think it would be mistaken to think that all the demands of indigenous peoples can be properly solved by recognizing rights of territorial autonomy. Indigenous peoples in Latin America are not only making demands of territorial autonomy, they are also, and sometimes exclusively, making or raising demands of fair terms of inclusion, just as I said at the beginning of my presentation. Which this would be similar to, as I said previously, to the classification of group differentiated rights on Quebecois' version of multiculturalism. So if we think, this leads me, so if we think of these minorities as only under the lens of indigenous peoples, such as Canada or New Zealand or Australia or Scandinavian countries, or all these countries where these multicultural models of territorial autonomy for indigenous peoples have been successful, this would be a mistake in the case of the Latin American region, precisely because their demands are not only based on territorial autonomy. And here I will recall what I said previously, also with the fact that many indigenous peoples in the Latin American region are also facing serious disadvantages in terms of access to goods and resources and life opportunities. So, and group differentiated rights, especially rights of territorial autonomy, are not focused, are not concentrating on ameliorating this marginal situation of these minorities. They are rights that are thought as eradicating cultural-based injustices. So although it's not like they don't care for the positional situation of indigenous peoples, they are not intended to solve these problems. So for instance, even though we have recognized rights of territorial autonomy for these groups, the minorities that are indeed engaging in their own forms of social and political organization are still facing deep disadvantages in terms of access to goods, resources, and life opportunities. So it is important to note that group differentiated rights based on cultural differences will be insufficient to respond to the needs of, to all the needs and demands that these groups are making. So this is why I believe that this critique is partly correct. However, I do not think that this means that multiculturalism has failed or that we have to abandon multiculturalism. Rather, what I think it means is that we need to enable other sorts of policies, that will help us eradicate all the sources of injustices that these groups are facing. So, so this, as I say, this kind of makes me agree on this critique with these scholars, because I do think it would be a mistake to simply take a multicultural model that has been successful in Canada or in New Zealand or in Australia regarding Indigenous peoples, export it to our regions, and then expect it to be successful here. I think this does not work that way. So this leads me to remark something that I also said earlier, that is the fact that, as I understand it, there is a difference between multiculturalism as a political theory for managing cultural diversity, which holds up a set of principles which seek to recognize and accommodate cultural minorities, and models of multiculturalism. So as I understand it, the models of multiculturalism are the way these principles are transformed to rights or to policies. And this is the way how we seek to achieve the goals of a multicultural state. But there are different models, multicultural models. Some are group differentiated rights, some are group differentiated rights that are only based on territorial autonomy, or might be a mix of them. So for any model to be successful, I believe it needs to respond to the type of groups it's trying to accommodate and to the type of demands that these groups are raising. So in the case of the Latin American region, I do suggest that we need to develop our own multicultural model, for which we need to identify the type of cultural minorities that we're dealing with, the type of claims that these minorities are raising, and finally develop a model that incorporates different measures and tools that will properly address these claims. So this takes me to my concluding remarks. I believe that Latin American interculturalism shares similar principles and concerns as multiculturalism. I believe that the critiques that these scholars have been addressing against multiculturalism are inadequate and not rigorous enough. Especially, I believe they are only or mainly focused in the liberal versions of multiculturalism, and especially in Quebecois' version of multiculturalism. So that is why, and this is a reason why I think it is important to mention all these other versions of multiculturalism, both liberals and not liberals. And thirdly, I believe that Latin American interculturalism should not be understood as an alternative to multiculturalism, but rather as a multicultural model for Latin American societies that obviously needs to be better elaborated and more defined, but I do not believe it is an alternative to multiculturalism. So I will finish here, and I will be expecting and looking forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Yes, that was very interesting, and of course, you gave a very sympathetic account of multiculturalism. So how can I not like it? I like the place you ended up. I like the last point that you were discussing in relation to what we really need to think about is not, is there a problem with multiculturalism as a normative theory, but as it were, the policy interpretation, or as you put it, the model that is adopted in a particular time and place, or a particular country, and so on. And your argument that perhaps too many people, both advocates of multiculturalism and its critics have been too influenced by the choice of certain minorities as the kind of paradigm cases. And obviously this partly follows from Kimlicker's account of three kinds of minorities, which you referred to. But I know this will go against the grain for me, but I think I must make an effort. Let me try and say something in support of Will Kimlicker's position here. He did say that his model wasn't exhaustive, and it clearly isn't exhaustive, and that there was one very prominent case that he was quite troubled by right at the beginning of his career, right at the beginning of his theorizing, and he didn't know where to put them in his multicultural theory and kind of politics. And you're nodding, so I guess you...
African Americans?
Absolutely, yes. You realize that I'm referring to what he said about African Americans. And I think he was right, as I can see that you do too, that they don't fit very well into his typology. And he should really have thought more about that, oh, well, maybe there's something wrong with the typology. Because as you'll be aware, and as I think some other people may be aware, of course, I've gone on to criticize Will Kimlicker, that his theory doesn't fit countries like Britain, because the minorities that he wants to talk about, even though he of course focuses on migrants as part of what he calls polyethnicity, he assumes that these are migrants that have no connection to the country. But what about post-colonial migrants, which are, at least till the last couple of decades, were the standard case of ethnic minorities in Britain, people from the West Indies, from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, from West Africa, and so on. And finally, of course, he has very little to say about religious community-based migrants, like Muslims. So he's gone on to say more about them, but they don't really feature in his theory. So I suppose what I would want to say then to you is, have you not just found another set of cases, namely indigenous people in Mexico and in Latin America, which show that his typology is limited, but perhaps don't show that he wasn't aware of the limitations of his typology? I mean, I say this because I'm kind of bending over backwards to try to be fair to him, though I haven't argued that in my own work. But anyway, I'd like to hear you discuss that.
Well, first, yeah, I mean, I defend Kimlicka. I've always defended Kimlicka because I do believe that his theory of multiculturalism is not very well understood, especially with this typology thing. So as I understand him, he kind of developed this typology, but when he speaks or talks about African Americans, I think he's referring to, well, there are other type of groups that might not fit neatly in this typology, but I cannot develop a full typology of groups. So I think that is our job to do. So if we want to make multiculturalism work in different regions of the world, we need to understand our typology, or we need to understand the type of group we're dealing with, and not be like wanting to accommodate our groups within the typology of Kimlicka. So, I mean, I understand this critique that Kimlicka's typology is not incorporating or is not thinking on indigenous peoples in the Latin American region, but this does not mean that we need to reject his theory of multiculturalism. Rather, it means that, well, we can develop our own typology of groups, our own type of groups that we're dealing with, understand which are their claims and which is the nature of their claims, and then try to develop policies within multiculturalism that will properly address these claims. So I do not think that it's Kymlica's fault. I think it is our fault because we thought that Kymlica had solved everything. And so since Kymlica incorporates in his typology of minorities, indigenous peoples, we thought it was very easy, like, oh, we have indigenous peoples in our country, let's bring his multicultural model into our country. And then since it didn't work out, then blame Kymlica for not developing a theory of multiculturalism. I think that is the problem. So although I agree with this diagnosis of these interculturalists, as well as I agree with your diagnosis on Kymlica's typology of minorities, I do not think that it was on Kymlica's aims to only like have this typology and that's it. I think he has said it in other texts that he's open to other sorts of groups. And I think the case of the African Americans is really interesting because, as he says, like they share claims of some of nationalism, some of immigrants, but they're not indigenous peoples, and they're neither immigrants because, I mean, they were brought here by force, and then they were not even allowed to stay together. So they don't really have a societal culture, but because we didn't allow them, well, we like Americans. So well, I don't know if I'm responding to your.
No, I think that's a generous and fair response to the point about Kymlica. But your presentation, I mean, was very clear and very helpful, but it had a certain negative element, negative in the sense that you were saying to Latin American interculturalists, look, you haven't really sufficiently understood multiculturalists. You're making rather excessive generalizations about multiculturalists. Fine, I agree with that. But then just towards the end, you said, therefore, we in Mexico and in Latin America need to think of our own multiculturalism rather than say multiculturalism is no good for us, has no application for us. So what about taking that next step forward from the negative critique to the positive, not that you have to have a whole theory, obviously, but where are you going more positively to replace what we might call the old state multiculturalism with a more appropriate multiculturalism that you would endorse?
Yeah, well, maybe I was not as clear as I wish I would have been, because what I wish to say is that, and this is why I think it is important to draw the difference between multiculturalism and multicultural models, because as I understand it, I think this is helpful for understanding precisely this problem, because as I understand it, multiculturalism is a theory with basic principles that I think any version of multiculturalism can agree with. Then each version might have its particularities. Some might be liberal, some might be beyond liberalism, but I do believe they share these basic principles. And then something different are the models of multiculturalism. So what I concluded at the end is that we can still, I mean, we don't need to abandon this framework of multiculturalism as a political theory. We can still work under this framework but we cannot export models of multiculturalism that have been successful in other countries. So what we need to do is develop our own model of multiculturalism that might be some sort of group differentiated rights of individual autonomy, territorial autonomy. Some might also be similar to fair terms of inclusion, like for instance, incorporating their languages as official languages, national festivities, also incorporating them in our official calendar. So making all these sorts of adjustments that typically have been adjustments for ethnic minorities. But this can also be, or can also be applicable for the indigenous groups that we have in our region, precisely because they're not so territorially concentrated, and many of them are intermixed in the majoritarian culture. So what I wanted to say is instead, we can still work under a multicultural framework, but we need to develop our own model of multiculturalism, which would need to identify the type of minorities we're dealing with, as well as their demands, and then develop all of these measures that are working within a multicultural framework, but might be different than other multicultural models. So this is to say that we don't need to abandon multiculturalism. We can still do this within a multicultural framework. So I don't know if this is a little more.
Okay, well, we might come to that. I don't know. Depends what people want to ask you, to see if we can put a bit more flesh on that. But anyway, you're not here just to talk to me. So can I invite other people, if they'd like to make a comment, ask a question, make a suggestion as to where the argument should go, in general or specifically about Latin America? No one seems.
Goodness, might I say something?
Yes, Judith, please come in. Yeah.
Okay, hi. I'm an African American. I am always interested in any kind of cultural study, especially Latin American studies or Latinx studies, because it is the fastest growing population in the United States. So from my standpoint, especially being an educated African American, I believe we should really want to embrace Latin Americans and know that they, surely by population, are the future. Now, as far as, I guess I get out of sorts with just trying to follow the difference with multiculturalism and the way we always taught, and I hate to make everything sound so simple, is it's just a matter of, are we allowed to have diversity within our own culture? You know what I mean? Or is it everyone has to be on a certain model because we're minorities? And I'm not, like, for example, I'm not liberal, but I am not conservative. And in my family, we have people who are so conservative, I can't sit at a table with them. But then at the same token, we have people in my family who are so liberal, I'm like, okay, look, you cannot come in the house and marry a chicken. Okay. I think it's hard to put a label on anything. Yeah, but I have to say this. I think part of the issue, why we're having this conversation, why we have to have this conversation. I can't speak to other countries. I don't know what it's like there. I mean, I've visited, which is different from living. What I can speak to is being in the United States, we have an Anglo population that appears to be terrified of not being in charge. Where I think what maybe might be useful is if they understood that, and I hate, again, labels, minorities, we're not your enemies. We actually can be a super support to the country because we can infuse it with new vitality. And I think if the group that does feel that way understood that, then there would really be no need for labeling anything to begin with. Now, I probably am like way, way out there, but that's just my take. I am enjoying the talk, though. I am super enjoying it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Judith. So, Alexandra, feel free to respond.
Yeah, I'm not very sure I kind of understood if it was a question or just a comment.
Yeah, I think.
Actually, in a way, it is a question because I'm just trying, I'm struggling with, I guess, understanding the difference between what is it, multiculturalism, and what is the other label?
Interculturalism.
And interculturalism. Because like for me, interculturalism almost sounds like the issue of intersectionalism. And I don't know, is it similar or?
Well, well, I've been arguing that interculturalism and multiculturalism are very similar than they wish they would. So interculturalists are claiming that they have a better way for dealing with diversity, and at least the versions of interculturalism that I am studying, I think they are very similar to multiculturalism. So my answer, on my opinion, is that these versions of interculturalism are basically the same as multiculturalism. So they have all these concerns regarding diversity that I think are shared by multiculturalism. However, there are other versions of interculturalism that, and those I believe are a little different than multiculturalism, but because they're not making a lot of focus on groups, and they're trying to go beyond this idea, this groupist idea, and they're trying to understand individuals on their own terms. So I think this would be a very difficult question to respond in a few minutes, but as I understand it, interculturalism and multiculturalism are very similar. And it might be related with intersectionality. So there are some studies within multiculturalism that are talking about minorities within minorities. So
exactly, yeah.
So this could be the case of women in patriarchal groups, or women in African American societies or groups. So they are a minority within a minority. And there is also a whole discussion within multiculturalism on how we should protect these minorities within minorities. So it is related with intersectionality, but I think intersectionality is a different, has its own studies on its own.
Okay, I wish that people were having more of these talks elsewhere, because I think there is just so much to gain from embracing other groups of people other than this is the way it's always been, because nothing ever stays the same. So yeah, you know what? Really super great. I can't wait to get back and because this is being recorded to see the whole thing, because I'm doing this during lunch and my lunch is just about done. So God, thank you so much. And I'll look for the recording.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, Judith, from presumably across the Atlantic Ocean, as it's your lunch time and we're coming up to tea time or dinner time. Yeah. Does anyone else want to come in on this debate with your own points or relating to what Alexandra has said? Yeah, Pierre, go ahead.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Alexandra, for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if one solution perhaps to the situation of indigenous peoples who are territorially dispersed in Latin America and Mexico could be to consider them as ethnic minorities, unlike those who are territorially concentrated, who could be treated more like indigenous peoples. And I'm thinking actually it's not only a problem for Mexico, because in other places like Canada, like Australia, not all indigenous peoples live on reservations. A lot of them are dispersed in cities, for instance, and it's true that Quebecois theory doesn't really account for those people. So do you think that could be a possible way forwards to kind of distinguish between those who are concentrated and those who aren't concentrated, and then try and incorporate on fair terms those who are, say, living among the majority population? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. So I do think that, I mean, obviously, group differentiated rights based on territorial autonomy are useless for indigenous peoples that are not territorially concentrated. So that's the same as nothing. So if we're thinking of only this approach to multiculturalism, or leaving behind all these groups or all these indigenous peoples that still identify as indigenous, but are not territorially concentrated. So definitely, but this does not mean that they still don't have claims of recognition, that they're not still raising claims of recognition that are more similar to those recognized by Quebecois for ethnic minorities. So I do believe that one solution would be to, and actually that's how it's been treated in the Mexican Constitution, for example. We do have not only rights of territorial autonomy, but we also have rights of fair terms of their inclusion, which are similar, like some adaptations in the criminal procedures, for example, in order to recognize cultural practices that might be criminal offenses, but because they are made or perpetrated by an indigenous people, there might be some kind of consideration on it. So, and the many other possibilities of rights that are not based on territorial autonomy, but on recognition of their difference. But and maybe I didn't have enough time to elaborate a little more on this, because it's not only, the problem is not only with the fact that they're not territorially concentrated. The problem also is that we have a lot of indigenous groups. It's not only like the Maui and the majoritarian culture, or the Maori, sorry. It's not, there are thousands of groups, of indigenous groups in Mexico. So, and of different ways of identifying as indigenous, precisely because we had all this process of assimilation. So many of them have lost many aspects of their culture, such as language, or even their territory, but nevertheless, they still identify as indigenous. So we have kind of a continuum of a multicultural continuum on our society. And so this is why it's sometimes difficult to enable policies or group differentiated rights that will respond to all of these groups. But yeah, I totally think that a solution is to kind of to start working under these policies that are more similar to the ones of ethnic minorities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. Does anyone else want to come in? Yep. PD 17064, please go ahead. Did you, assuming you want
that was me. That was me. Sorry.
It just flashed up. I've got two screens here, and when there's any motion in one location, it came up. I see. Right. Okay. Thanks. Well, maybe while people are thinking, if they do have something they want to come in, we could just explore a bit further what multiculturalism might look like in Mexico, you know, a better version of multiculturalism, and building on the idea that the concept of ethnic minorities, as it's used in various places, including Britain, might be helpful. And I think this kind of relates to the earlier point about African Americans, because one of the things about ethnic minorities in Britain is, of course, that they are, regarded as racialized groups. And we talk about racial equality and anti-racism just as much as we do about multiculturalism and ethnic minorities, in fact, perhaps more so actually. So I wonder if ideas about racialization and othering, and therefore anti-racialization and de-othering, would be ideas that you would want to incorporate into the kind of multiculturalist approach that you think Mexico could benefit from?
I'm not sure I'm totally understanding what you're referring to.
Well,
can you elaborate a little?
Yeah, sure. So in a way, this goes back to the idea of what kind of groups would multiculturalism in Mexico be engaging with? What would be the object of multiculturalism or the subjects of multiculturalism? So Piers just said, well, it may be that what you're talking about groups as ethnic minorities rather than as indigenous territorial groups. And you seem to, warm to that idea. You seem to see the sense. And earlier we were talking about African Americans as a distinct kind of group that liberal multiculturalism, at least Will Kimlicker's multiculturalism, wasn't engaging with. So I then, if you like, taking one step further and saying, well, perhaps what African Americans and British ethnic minorities have in common is that they are groups that are subject, historically and today, subject to forms of racism, which in some ways give the group a certain kind of character, even if it's a character from the outside that the groups then are resisting against, trying to assert their own identity. But nevertheless, that assertion exists in a context of where they are being racialized, where they're being given an identity from the outside, an inferior identity. Do those ideas operate in Mexico? Do people use ideas like that, and would you like to use ideas like that?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand what you're suggesting, well, yeah, I think indigenous peoples in Mexico are not only cultural minorities, they're also positional groups. So here I would kind of take what Iris Marion Jung has developed regarding positional groups. And so this means they face other sorts of injustice. And some of these injustices are precisely the perceptions that majoritarian culture has towards them. So I think a multicultural model that could kind of properly address all these sorts of injustice that these groups are facing also would need to make some emphasis on the positive things that these minorities or these cultures can have, or like all these ideas that maybe they will have on communality or on the relation with nature and so on, that we can benefit from those perception, from those ways of thinking or ways of viewing the world. And that would help us, the majoritarian culture would help us change our perception on these groups, that because we are the ones who are generating this sense of difference and of exclusion and of positions. So so precisely because we're relational, we are advantaged precisely because they are disadvantaged. So we need to change those dynamics. And I would suggest that we would need to make more emphasis in the majoritarian culture and the way we perceive these minorities. So this would have to be done by making us value positively their cultures, their practices, their views of the world. And I mean, I am aware that this is very complex and maybe very ideal, but I do think that we should try to, that would need to be incorporated in any model of multiculturalism if we wish to achieve ethnocultural justice in these countries. I don't know if that is what you're kind of.
I mean, that is an answer. Yeah, sure. So I wonder, do you see that as taking, well, look, I'll stop because Laura has indicated she'd like to come in. So why don't you come in, Laura?
Thank you. Thank you for a really inspiring talk. I'm from Denmark, so I'm from a totally different society than both the Latin American, the British, and the American who has been raised here. And I'm just thinking, I'm working with schools and education and so on. And in that field, we see the discussion about anti-racism and multiculturalism in terms of also how these can be connected. And that's why I also want to support what you're saying, Tariq, in terms of adding the racist and the racialized structures and so on to the discussion about multiculturalism, but not just as something that you add, but something that you see as combined with the kind of cultural forms that are created. So I would say that what we see in minorities that have been, that have experienced racism for generations is that their cultural forms are shaped by this racism and by these racialized structures and so on. So you have to see them in combination, and it's you cannot see this, you cannot see their cultural forms without discussing what they have been through for generations and how that has transformed the way their practices, their family forms, their educational forms, and so on. So I'm wondering, how is that part of multiculturalism that you are arguing for, or how do you see that?
So I take it that's a question for Alexandra. So
yeah, well, I mean, so going back to the example of African Americans, I mean, precisely because the majoritarian culture had them excluded from the mainstream society. So these minorities started to develop their own sense of identification, and they started developing their own culture. So, but it was precisely because they were excluded and they were obligated to kind of survive, and they started developing their own cultural differences that afterwards were used like to refer to race positively, and then to be demanded equality and recognition of these different cultures or of their own different culture. So yeah, I mean, I do think that at least in the in the indigenous peoples in the Latin American region, I mean, part of their identity has been created precisely because we have forbidden them from accessing to full citizenship during so many years. And we have kind of maintained them in a marginalized situation. We have kind of cornered them to develop their own sense of identity, first of all, and secondly, their own to continue exercising their own cultural and political ways of organization. So, I mean, if we were the ones who generated that situation, then and then this is we were the ones who created that sense of identity and that like common project within them, then when they start making claims to us of recognition and accommodation of these practices that they had to be developed for like surviving, then yeah, of course we should, I mean, we also have this kind of historic depth with them. So I don't know if that's what you're, what you were trying to ask.
Yes, exactly. That was what I was looking for, because it sounded like it was something that you could, divide. You can talk about it as a racialized group, and then about their cultural forms as something that are different. But I see that what you mean now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think the issues that Laura's raised and that we were already talking about, they provoke me to ask. So you were borrowing from Will Pimlico, but saying, this was a positive element of his theory that you wanted to retain, fair terms of inclusion. Now, as you and everyone else will be aware, so when we talk about fair terms and so on, we usually are talking about distribution of resources or some kind of contract, like when I talk about social contract. It's a kind of very Rawlsian way of thinking, but it's very, very common in political theory. And so that's the kind of language that Will Pimlico uses. But if we go back to what you were saying just now, and what Laura was talking about how people are, how they've been formed over periods of time and so on, we're then really talking about their identity, not just about their disadvantage, for instance, or the fact that they may have been excluded from certain positions of power and so on. And I personally have found it much more useful to talk about recognition rather than about fairness, because recognition is a concept specifically about, focused on identities, people's identities as a people, rather than issues about fairness, which is more like, the distribution of a cake. So I wonder what attracts you so much to thinking in terms of fair terms of inclusion rather than, for instance, recognition.
Mainly, I mean, I borrowed the term from Pimlico just to make it a little more easy to kind of distinguish between the different claims, because I think there has usually been a confusion on the claims that these groups are making. And even if we take a look at the literature of multiculturalism in Mexico, for example, because there are multiculturalists that are trying to defend multiculturalism for Mexico, they tend to make this mistake precisely that I was referring to before, like thinking, well, Pimlico has a typology of groups, and on his typology there are indigenous minorities, and to indigenous minorities we should grant them territorial autonomy, and so we already solved the problem of multiculturalism. So it's not so simple than that. It's not as simple as just doing this like exercise. So that this is why I suggest that we should try to understand the claims and the difference between the claims that indigenous peoples are making, which are not all based on territorial autonomy. And the reason why I just borrowed the term, I mean, I didn't give it much of a thought, although I do agree that it would be much better talking of recognition. And but the truth is that I didn't think about it so much. I just like to be talking on the same language and the same terminology. I just borrowed the term because after all, Quebecois' account of multiculturalism defends that ethnic minorities should have what he calls fair terms of inclusion, but what kind of means like redesigning institutions or practices so that also it also incorporates the practices of minorities. So it's just that was my motivation. But I mean, I do agree. I do think that you have a point, and probably I will change this.
Yeah, well, it's worth thinking about. I mean, inclusion obviously is an important term. You wouldn't want to lose that. But I think recognition tends to also be about inclusion and accommodation.
Well, yeah, because after all, I mean, Quebecois, when he talks of fair terms of inclusion for ethnic minorities, he's working under the assumption that ethnic minorities are willing to adapt or to kind of adapt to our society, to this host society. But what they are demanding in exchange is terms of inclusion or inclusion. So I think that that might be the reason why he incorporates this, the fair terms, because it's like a negotiation, which I think would not apply in indigenous peoples in our countries. So I mean, I will correct that. Thank you, Tariq.
Well, we're coming towards the end. I'm very conscious that we haven't had a lot of people in. You've had a lot of me talking to Alexandra. So if you do have a comment or a question that you'd like to raise, you know, you've got to more or less do it now, because otherwise we will have finished. Okay, well, if people don't have a question, that's fair enough as well. Before I thank Alexandra, I'd just like to tell the rest of you that we'll meet again in 2 weeks' time, when we'll have a talk by Leon Tickley, who is at this university in the School of Education. And so it's a talk about racial equality and education. In fact, it's about the recent government report, the Sewell report. And Leon's actually already published a paper that his talk will be based on, published it in Ethnicities. And so when you receive more details of the talk tomorrow from Johan, she'll attach a copy of the paper if you want to look at it in advance. So I'll now thank you again, Alexandra. It's been good to connect with you again, but it's been very good to hear your very clear presentation about why Latin American interculturalists need to think a little bit more about what multiculturalisms exist out there, rather than have a little bit of a caricature and then to knock down a caricature. That's been very helpful to us. Well, I hope we'll meet again in person in Bristol or somewhere else in the near future. And that applies to everybody else who's still in the seminar room. And on that note, I'll say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you very much, Tariq, and everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.